PNA. In the face of the explosion of the North Korean nuclear device, the danger of an Iranian bomb, and the imminent danger of a breakdown of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime, the Project for Nuclear Awareness brought together a conference on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. First came the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Massive Cold War nuclear escalation followed rapidly. Finally, strong treaties began to take hold as the insanity of an unlimited nuclear arms race was clear to all. Nuclear weapons stockpiles began to shrink, and then the wall came down, and we forgot how scared we had been. But what about now? Activist Helen Caldicott.
I find that most people have no idea that there are thousands of nuclear weapons on both sides, Russia and America, on hair trigger alert.
It took 2 world wars and an intervening long period of isolation as before the United States recognized that a stable international order could only be realized through collective action based upon agreed standards and norms of behavior. This in turn led to the creation of the United Nations and its sister international institutions, as well as a series of treaty regimes which gave the free world its security throughout the long period of the Cold War.
I'm going to show you a Trident submarine. A Trident submarine contains 24 missiles, so each one of these pages is a missile. On each missile is 8 hydrogen bombs. Some have 6, some have 8. 8 hydrogen bombs, each hydrogen bomb up to 40 times as large as the Hiroshima bomb. 10 to 40 times as large. This is one Trident. Almost enough weapons on this Trident to destroy billions of people.
Or Stanislav Petrov in 1983 when the computers in the then Soviet Union indicated a launch, and the only reason that the world survives is he broke protocol and didn't pass the information up the chain of command. And had he done that, we wouldn't have a world. He said they just wouldn't have had time to decide whether to use them or lose them. And the interesting thing, I had the privilege of interviewing him for a documentary, and I asked him, what gave you the courage and humility to do this? And he said, well, first I was a computer engineer and I knew computers made mistakes. But second is, he said, God didn't want to end the world.
So in 1995, you all know this I'm sure, Norway launched a missile with a weather satellite on it near where the Trident submarines roam at all times, silently, cryptogenically. And they picked this up. I guess their satellites were still working at the time. They said, my God, America's launched a first strike. And there's Yeltsin, a hardened alcoholic. You know, a bottle of vodka for breakfast type of alcoholic. Wernicke's encephalopathy, Korsakoff syndrome for sure. Sitting before his computer, and his generals were standing over his shoulder saying, press that button, Mr. President. He had 3 minutes to make a decision. He procrastinated. 10 seconds before the end of the 3 minutes elapsed, when he would have had to make a decision and press the button, the missile veered off course and he closed the computer. That's why we're sitting here in the National Press Club today and we're not radioactive atoms floating around in the stratosphere. 10 seconds from annihilation, we were.
So thinking outside the bomb is an act of vision, of thinking beyond the old ideas. And the top 5 issues are surprisingly clear-cut. No new nuclear weapons. Ban weapons in outer space. Respect our treaties. De-alert existing weapons. And finally, a nuclear weapons-free world. The first of the top 5 issues. Build no new nuclear weapons.
So what's new today? What's new today is the Bush administration and the Department of Energy are proposing essentially to rebuild the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal. We don't want to make it bigger, they say. They merely want to replace all the warheads in the current arsenal with new, redesigned, improved, and more reliable warheads. And they want to do that by building a new nuclear weapons complex called Complex 2030. And that basically will involve spending tens of billions of dollars over the next 2 decades to recreate a Cold War-style ability to design, develop, and produce nuclear weapons. In my view, that's a dangerous and wrong path, but my opinion is very firm that this administration push gives us the opportunity to call for a new debate on nuclear policy in the United States and to basically create a situation in which the next president, whoever that may be, he or she, Democrat or Republican, will have the chance to make a real change in U.S. nuclear policy of the type I think Ambassador Graham outlined earlier today. Complex 2030 is, as I said, this new manufacturing capability to basically produce new nuclear weapons. And then I have 2 quotes there from the man who is the current acting secretary of what's called the National Nuclear Security Agency, NNSA, in Beltway talk, basically saying that this complex will give them the ability to produce new weapons. The current designs for the RRW are, by law, not to have any new missions or new capabilities. But the DOE wants to have Complex 2030 so they can, down the road, develop and deploy new types of weapons with new missions and new roles. So the reasons they want this complex now to build these RRW warheads is to maintain the ability in the long run to field new types of weapons that do have new missions. This is a quick shot of the current U.S. nuclear complex. It is still quite a large thing, spread across the country, 3 weapons labs, 8 production facilities, and a host of other sites that are involved in the whole process, just to give you a sense of what that big nuclear set of things is in the U.S. It is large. It is not small. The interesting thing about the DOE proposal is the DOE says they're consolidating and making a more rational plan for the complex. Right now, there are 8 main facilities that are involved in building nuclear weapons or related to nuclear weapons production. In their new consolidated plan, there will be 8 facilities. This is just a quick shot of all the things that are in the warhead. Most of them are non-nuclear, and most of them, even though we're not doing nuclear testing, can be tested. So there are literally hundreds of parts in each weapon, and we can test those things without going through a full-scale nuclear test by doing non-nuclear testing. Here's the key fact in terms of the debate about this need for a more reliable arsenal. The arsenal already is reliable. For the last 11 years, the labs certified that the weapons we have are reliable, safe, and well-maintained. We have spent billions of dollars to make sure that happens. And so there's very little doubt that the weapons we have will work if they're ever needed.
The second of the top 5 issues, ban weapons in outer space.
But it was a fascinating time because we were in space for the first time, we and the Russians, and some very basic questions were on the table. For one thing, who owns it? I mean, was this a situation where, like Columbus discovers the New World, could like Columbus said, you know, I lay claim to this new world in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And eventually we got down to actually framing a treaty. We were looking for a model. What would be the model on which we would base the treaty? And the model we used was Antarctica. That was the model for the Outer Space Treaty. And what Antarctica basically said was that nobody could own it, that there would be right of mutual inspection, that exploration would be for the benefit of all mankind. And those were the principles that became cranked into the Outer Space Treaty, which was eventually put together in 1967. On the question of ownership, we decided, we meaning the world, decided that nobody would own it, that it would be common territory, that it would be open for exploration, and that military stations in outer space, for instance on the moon or Mars, would be subject to inspection. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, as they used to say on the radio programs. A number of other things had happened. The world had moved into the peaceful uses of outer space, and they had moved in very, very strongly. There are now literally hundreds of billions of dollars directly invested in outer space peaceful satellites. Our entire communication system is based on satellites. It also means that countries which, in areas of the world which used to be inaccessible to telephone lines, areas in the desert, areas in the jungle, areas in Antarctica and places like that, are directly accessible because of satellite communication. It has made possible something which wasn't even dreamed about 50 years ago. We also have now a world weather system. It used to be a joke, all these wonderful jokes about predicting the weather, but the weather system is pretty good now. And one of the reasons it's pretty good is because it's a world weather system, that we can now access whole areas of the world which we could not cover prior to satellite communication. And this has reaped enormous benefits, billions of dollars of benefit, for instance, in direct knowing what the weather is going to be, but also knowing what the long-term weather is going to be for crops, for communication, for navigation, and so forth. Most spectacularly, it's come in science, because prior to satellites, we were looking at the entire world through the fog of the atmosphere. We know what the universe looks like. We know, for instance, now, in a way we never could have dreamed of, that there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe. When we begin to talk about the weaponization of space, what we are saying is that this kind of investment is really a jeopardy. And as Grego mentioned to you, the big reason for that, the biggest reason, is debris. It sounds harmless. However, a piece of debris in low Earth orbit is traveling at 17,000 miles an hour. 17,000 miles an hour. What does this mean? This means that a 10-pound piece of debris hits you with the power of a truck. And that means that as we add to the debris, as it circulates around the Earth, we're making it almost impossible for other satellites to circulate as well. Right now, the debris level is fairly low, despite the Chinese test. It added, 10 to 20%. But if we actually got into a weaponization program, of course we would test it. And if we tested it, we would massively increase the debris, particularly in low Earth orbit. And we would make impossible this vast investment in peaceful uses satellites. But more than that, if we got into this business, if we got into weaponizing space, if we got into putting actually military satellites as weapons in space, we would almost inevitably provoke a space arms race. If we put up weapons, they will put up weapons. This is a situation to be avoided. And fortunately, there is a very clear way to avoid it. And that clear way is to extend the 1967 treaty so that it includes all weapons. That is, not simply weapons of mass destruction, but all weapons.
The third of the top 5 issues: respect our treaties.
The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, is the centerpiece of world security. President John F. Kennedy truly feared that nuclear weapons might sweep all over the world. In 1962, there were reports that by the late 1970s, there would be 25 to 30 nuclear weapon states in the world with nuclear weapons integrated into their arsenals. If that had happened, there would be many more such states today, But such weapon proliferation did not happen, and the principal reason that it did not was the negotiation of the NPT and its entry into force in 1970, buttressed by the policies of extended nuclear deterrence, the so-called nuclear umbrella, followed by the United States and the Soviet Union with their Cold War treaty allies. Indeed, since 1970, at least until now, there has been very little nuclear weapon proliferation. In addition to the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized by the NPT, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, 3 states outside the NPT, India, Pakistan, and Israel, and perhaps North Korea, have built nuclear weapon arsenals. But India and Israel were already well along in 1970. This is far from what President Kennedy feared. But the success of the NPT was no accident. It was rooted in a carefully crafted central bargain. In exchange for a commitment for the non-nuclear weapon states, today more than 180 countries, most of the world, from them, not to acquire nuclear weapons and to submit to international safeguards to verify compliance with this commitment, the NPT nuclear weapon states pledged unfettered access to peaceful nuclear technologies and undertook to engage in nuclear disarmament negotiations aimed at the ultimate elimination of their nuclear arsenals. It is this basic bargain that for the last 3 decades has formed the central underpinnings of the international non-proliferation regime. However, one of the principal problems with all of this has been that the nuclear weapon states have never really delivered on the disarmament part of this bargain. And the United States, in recent years, appears to have largely abandoned it. And now the other side of the bargain has begun to fall apart. India and Pakistan eroded the NPT from the outside by each conducting a series of nuclear weapon tests in 1998 and declaring themselves to be nuclear weapon states. India, Pakistan, and Israel maintain sizable, unregulated nuclear weapon arsenals outside of the treaty. North Korea withdrew from the NPT in 2003 and may have built up to 8 to 10 nuclear weapons. While the new agreement with North Korea is promising, there is not resolution as yet of the ultimate disposition of this potential arsenal. The A.Q. Khan secret illegal nuclear weapon technology transferring regime based in Pakistan has been exposed, but who can be sure that we've seen more than the tip of the iceberg? Iran is suspected of having a nuclear weapon program and admitted in 2003 that contrary to its IAEA safeguards agreement, it failed to report its acquisition of uranium enrichment technology. The Iranian case has become more serious and now is a major crisis.
In December of 2001, the President abrogated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972. This was the agreement we had with the Russians that each of us would only build 1 missile defense site. And the United States abrogated the treaty. And interestingly enough, it took 6 months because of the terms of the treaty for it to actually, that abrogation to go into effect. And during those 6 months, a bunch of states sued the president, actually brought the president, Vice President Cheney, and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to court on the basis that they had not consulted when they knocked the treaty out. They had not consulted, and beyond that, of course, they had not gotten a vote of either one of the houses, particularly the Senate, in order to do it. And the congressman challenged the president's constitutional right to unilaterally abrogate a treaty. And eventually, the case got to the District of Columbia, and bad luck, we ran across a Bush appointee, and we lost. So right now, we have a precedent on the books that the president can abrogate a treaty without even consulting Congress. And that means that the entire treaty structure of the United States is vulnerable.
So is ratification of the CTB perhaps the most important action the U.S. and the international community could take?
I think that's the most significant that you could take now, because it really acts as a forceful signal. There are many other things that can be done, much less dramatic, like taking weapons off hair-trigger alert, or you can remove nuclear weapons from the European territory. Why should there be any nuclear weapons on the Western European territory? And in Russia, on the other side, they could also withdraw it much further to increase the détente.
Ambassador Thomas Graham made a very compelling statement, a very powerful statement about his thought that the rapid spread of nuclearization and nuclear weapons to other nations was so imminent that it really was in the U.S. best interest to spearhead a leadership role in eliminating weapons altogether. How practical is this? Where do you see this going?
Well, immediately you do not do it, but you can change the course. And I think that someone said about Iran that, look, are you amazed that Iran will want to develop or may want to develop nuclear weapons when the UK is saying that they need it for deterrence? Maybe Iran will also say the same thing. They have 100,000 American troops in Iraq, and they have American bases in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and a NATO ally on the other side. So deterrent will be something that anyone can speak about.
What would you say to nations who are hesitating to join the international inspection regime, particularly the United States?
Well, I would say that if there is a peaceful activity, for instance, in the chemical weapons sphere, the United States accepts inspection all over the sphere. They accept inspection of the destruction of the chemical stocks that they have, and chemical industry as well. In the nuclear area, they will not accept inspection on their weapons industries or on processes leading to weapons, and that is understandable. No weapons states does that. But when it comes to enrichment and reprocessing, I think they could. The UK and France have enrichment of uranium and reprocessing to make plutonium, and they have Euratom verification of that. Brazil, Japan, similarly, they have inspection of it. I don't see why the United States should also not be able to do so. It will cost a bit of money, but it's doable.
The fourth of the top 5 issues: de-alert existing weapons on hair-trigger status.
I'm really pleased to say that there is a real practical analysis called the Weapons of Terror report from the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, which should just lay to rest forever any argument that there's no practical route to addressing this dilemma. And although the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission report, the commission was chaired by Dr. Blix, whom you'll hear later today, it was a bunch of commissioners of a fairly wide range, including William Perry was in the group. And what's important is it lays out the practical steps that will lead us to fulfill the compass point of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I want to just lay out some of the steps that are highlighted in the book. But I want to point out that although, of course, the compass point has to be nuclear elimination, because as Senator Alan Cranston, my political mentor, continually reminded us, nuclear weapons are unworthy of civilization. They're both impractical, but they're morally unworthy, because they are weapons of terror. They are weapons of indiscriminate effect. They are terrorism by the state. And if we're going to have any kind of cooperation in the world in dealing with global warming, protecting the oceans, protecting the global commons, dealing with global poverty, it's utterly inconceivable that that would ever be achieved in a nuclear apartheid world, where some countries claim the right of absolute security, the willingness to risk all history, civilization, for their self-interest, and then say others can't have that, and then turn around and ask those others to restrain themselves, to take long-term environmental responsibility seriously, and restrain themselves from short-term economic interest, in the interest of our cooperation, while we're threatening them. It's just not practical nor moral. But the kind of steps we're talking about, I believe, meet these criteria. They They enhance security without diminishing any state's security. They enhance the rule of law, and they're all doable. What are we suggesting as steps to move toward that compass that are in the Commission report? One, a fissile material cutoff treaty. Stop the production of any more of these dangerous materials. How obvious that would be. And in fact, the United States has even proposed this at the CD in Geneva. But it's lacking a provision for verification. So we say, just like Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. It's not a very big leap for people to get that. Cut off any more of this material and verify it. Two, we have a treaty with Moscow called the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, the SORT Treaty, which calls for the deployment of no more than 2,200 strategic warheads by 2012. But it contains no provision for verification. So, the START Treaty's verification provisions end in 2009. We have a protocol for doing verification. Simply take that model and add it onto the SORT Treaty. But add one provision, make it international and transparent to the international community. It's not a radical provision. This is the START Treaty was supported by Republicans as well. Then, de-alert the weapons. It's absolutely unconscionable that as we sit here, as Dr. Caldecott pointed out, the weapons are still hanging over our head. But again, is this a big, is this a radical proposal? By no means. In fact, let me quote George W. Bush. This is when he was a candidate before a president. But still, he did say that we should, and I quote, remove as many weapons as possible from high alert hair trigger status, another unnecessary vestige of the Cold War confrontation. Preparation for quick launch within minutes after warning of an attack was the rule during the era of superpower rivalry. But today, for two nations at peace, to keep so many weapons on high alert may create an unacceptable risk of accidental or unauthorized launch. Mr. President, we agreed with you when you were a candidate. Hardly a radical gesture. Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the sine qua non of stopping the arms race. It's in the preamble of the NPT. We promised it in '95, and again at the General Assembly of the UN, only 2 countries voted against moving in that direction. Reaffirming our negative security assurances, countries that have forsworn nuclear weapons should have the assurance they won't be threatened with them. Now, these are the kinds of steps for which I can tell you there is nearly universal consensus in the world. Our job is to force the public scrutiny. That is our job. And I hope that the Project for Nuclear Awareness will pinpoint that specific lacuna. How to bring these issues into the internet conversations. How to bring them before the learned professional organizations, the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association. How to bring it before the business groups. How to bring these issues that are practical, threat-reducing, law-enhancing, and that have nearly a universal consensus into the public debate. That's where we have failed, and that's what we are responsible for doing. Wise people from time immemorial have been admonishing humanity to see humanity as one family, as having one destiny, as being interrelated, as being whole, as a spiritual and wisdom imperative. But now it's become a practical imperative. So there's this joining of practicality and hardcore realism and moral imperative. What could be more compelling?
The fifth of the top 5 issues, move toward a world free of nuclear weapons. Ambassador Thomas Graham, who personally helped negotiate many of the important nuclear treaties, describes the path forward.
In the context of a breakdown of world order and the war on terror, with the potential failure of the NPT and the ensuing likelihood of widespread nuclear proliferation that President Kennedy so rightly feared many years ago, an increasing possibility, with nuclear tension a growing threat, with thousands of strategic nuclear weapons still on high alert, and a Russian early warning system continuing to decline in effectiveness, it is perhaps too late for nuclear arms limitation. In the interest of the security and safety of us all, a way must be found to proceed directly to the elimination of nuclear weapons, as Paul Nitze suggested over 7 years ago, and as the authors of the January 4th op-ed article urge. Very difficult, but not impossible. It could begin with a speech by the President of the United States at the United Nations, stating that it is now United States policy that all nations must cooperate to proceed directly and as fast as is practical to the elimination of nuclear weapons throughout the world. Furthermore, any nation that refuses to consider this should be considered not part of the community of nations. Any nation that subsequently violates the negotiated arrangements would be considered an outlaw and subject to economic and, if necessary, military joint action by the world community. The negotiated agreement over many years could reduce nuclear weapons worldwide in stages to 0 weapons, with only a modest amount of nuclear explosive material from which a small number of nuclear weapons could be reconstituted, held by the 5 NPT recognized nuclear weapon states and the 3 NPT holdouts in differing amounts as a hedge against failure of the agreement. This material would be under strict national and international safeguards. Nuclear explosive material in both military and civil programs would be eliminated throughout the world, and civil nuclear power production, absolutely essential to the world economy, would be reconfigured to make no more weapon-usable material. The President would then call on the UN Security Council to begin and manage negotiations toward a worldwide agreement on the elimination of nuclear weapons based on these principles. Some might say that this is unrealistic. How could we ever hope that the United States government or any other state possessing nuclear weapons would ever contemplate such a thing? But we must press for and hope for the best and remember that nothing good is ever impossible. Who would have thought that the 0 missile option proposed by President Reagan in 1981 would ever happen? Who would have thought the Cold War would end in the foreseeable future? Who would have thought that the Soviet Union would cease to exist? But all of these things did happen. But in order to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons and to establish a peaceful and secure world community in the 21st century, the United States must lead. There is no alternative. But for this to happen, the United States must be believed and trusted. On September 12, 2001, the United States had the trust and support of the entire world. Now, in the wake of exaggerated intelligence claims, rejection of international treaty arrangements, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the Ottawa Convention on Landmines, the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocol on Global Warming, and others, an invasion of Iraq opposed by the world community, and dismissal by some of the rules of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Protocols on the treatment of prisoners of war, that support and trust is gone. How can we regain the trust of the world community? How can we return to our historic destiny of keeping the peace and fostering the development of the community of nations, democracies, free market economies, the international rule of law, international institutions, and treaty arrangements? Among other things, we should, first, recognize that in the wake of the Cold War, the world has fundamentally changed. The nation-state system that has dominated international life for the last 350 years is rapidly deteriorating. Perhaps some 50 to 70 nations around the world are inexorably slipping into the category of failed states. We cannot go it alone. Poverty, disease, cultural misunderstandings, and machine gun societies around the world are central national security threats. These are the principal causes of international terrorism and the primary weapons in the battle against terror and declining world order are economic, political, social, cultural, and diplomatic, and only rarely military. And second, for over 50 years, the United States pursued a world order based on rules and international treaties that permitted the expansion of democracy and the enlargement of international security. In April of 2005, in a speech before the American Society of International Law, the Secretary of State said that when the United States respects its, quote, international legal obligations and supports an international system based on the rule of law, we do the work of making this world a better place, but also a safe and more secure place for America, close quote. We should take such steps as ratifying the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, joining the Ottawa Landmine Convention, becoming a part of the International Criminal Court, and establishing ourselves again as strong advocates of the international rule of law. And beyond this, we should implement all of the practical steps enumerated by the 4 January 4th op-ed authors and truly begin the process toward the worldwide, verifiable, and complete elimination of nuclear weapons. In this way, we can regain our historic role, and we can and we will effectively lead the world community to a safe, secure, stable, and just 21st century. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yet progress is possible towards a safer world. Recent progress with the resumption of six-party talks with North Korea, the shutdown of the Yongbyon nuclear reactor, and new international inspections of Iran have each signaled that peaceful methods can be a success. Dr. Jim Walsh.
I remember in the summer, this past summer, I wrote an article and gave a speech in Europe suggesting that North Korea was going to test a nuclear weapon. It was by the end of the year. As far as I'm the only person I know who said it. I'm sure there are others who must have said it, but I'm the only one I know who said it. So then, North Korea tests, and I think, I'm the man, I've got this down, So I'm on CNN, they say, you predicted the test and whatever, and what do you think? You think the six-party talks are going to restart? No way are the six-party talks going to restart, no way. So as you know, the six-party talks did restart soon afterwards. So, so who knows what part is right or wrong for what I have to say today. I'm also finally excited to be talking to you because I'm going to say something in this talk I have never, ever said before. So let's begin with North Korea. I'm not going to go through everything that's happened, but essentially we've been on a roller coaster since the spring of 2005. Back in the spring of 2005, little notice was the fact that people were already talking about a potential nuclear test. On July 4th, we had the missile tests, followed by some sanctions. Then around Columbus Day, we had a nuclear test by North Korea. And then not far after that, contrary to my prediction, we had the resumption of the six-party talks, and on February 13th, really a landmark agreement, the first agreement of its kind in quite some time, a concrete agreement with schedules and action steps that all parties are supposed to engage in over these next 60 days to move towards real negotiations to resolve the crisis. So we started in the spring of 2005 talking about the possibility of a nuclear test, and we've gone like this, and we're back to the highest point, the most optimistic, the most promising point in U.S.-North Korean relations that we've had in over 6 years. The decision to really get serious and meet came in a call from Chris Hill to the President the week before the midterm elections in November. And I think also part of what is fueling this is, frankly, you have to be blind to think that after 6 years this was a policy that was working. Well, let's talk very briefly about Iran. everyone focuses on President Ahmadinejad. It's important to remember that they have a different system of power than we do. The president is the president, but the president is not the decider in Iran. The supreme leader is the decider. The supreme leader is the most important policy actor in Iran. But like many economic populists who make big expansive promises to help everyone, and then you have a provocative foreign policy, Iran's economy has not produced the big gains that would have allowed him to redistribute a lot of wealth. And so now Iranians are unhappy with their economic situation. They feel like he hasn't followed through on his economic promises. So it's important to keep an eye on him, but it's important to watch the supreme leader and his interactions with the president. And the other thing to know about Iran is that it's a fractured polity, lots of different centers of power. It's decentralized, lots of divisions, lots of factions. Very quickly, I want to talk about the U.S. and Iran, and to give you a sense of the Iranian point of view and the U.S. point of view. The U.S. says that Iran, listen, this is suspicious, Iran. You're flaring all this natural gas, and you have all this oil, ranked in the top 10 for oil and natural gas reserves. Why in the world would you want nuclear energy? This is highly suspicious. And the Iranians turn around and say, well, when the Shah was the head of the government, you tried to sell us nuclear reactors. You told us we were running out of energy. And the fact now that you don't want us to have it, that just proves to us that it's really good and that we want some. The U.S. says Iran is determined to get nuclear weapons. And Iran says, no, we would never get nuclear weapons. Islam forbids it. We have a fatwa that says nuclear weapons, the production, stockpiling, or use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with the Quran. And the NPT gives us the right to enrich. Now, again, I think, as with the first one, both are true. I don't think Iran needs nuclear energy, but it's true that we tried to sell it to them in the 70s. I think it's true that there are elements in Iran that want nuclear weapons. In fact, in most countries, there are elements that want nuclear weapons. They want them today. There are elements that want to hedge. They want to have the capability to do it later if the situation is right. There are those who oppose it, those who only want energy. There are different constituencies. And I think the Iranians are right to say that Islam is important, that during the Iran-Iraq war, the military went to the clerics and said, we want to use chemical weapons. We're getting whacked by Saddam's chemical weapons. And the clerics originally said, no, that would violate the Quran. So the Quran is important. Will it prevent them from becoming a nuclear weapon state? I don't know, but it's wrong to dismiss this as completely irrelevant. And it's true that most countries have customarily been seen to have a right to enrich. Now there's a debate over, well, if you're not upholding your safeguards obligations, do you still have the right to enrich? And people can debate that. But the fact of the matter is Brazil enriches, and the U.S. enriches, and Japan enriches, and a nationalist Iran thinks it's being singled out. Now the U.S. says it lied to the IAEA. It most certainly lied to the IAEA, engaged in extensive, systematic concealment of its nuclear activities. The Iranians say they were forced to conceal it. Had they been public, the U.S. would have gone behind their back and tried to stop the transfer of legitimate, peaceful nuclear technology, just like they tried to stop the Bushehr reactor. And they're right about that, but that doesn't justify cheating on your safeguards agreements. So again, there's a little bit to both these sides. And the U.S. says, you got technology from AQ Khan network? Absolutely right, including, I think, most troubling design information related to the construction of a warhead. There are legitimate grievances, historical and otherwise, that both countries have with the other. There are legitimate reasons why they mistrust each other. It is not a one-sided story. I can understand why people are concerned that the U.S. might use military force. Some of the actions they're taking would be steps that are necessary if you're going to use military force, but they're not sufficient. And I have real doubts whether the U.S. is going to attack Iran. My own view, and I won't go through it all, is that there are important alternatives to military force. I was at the State Department last week, and I am told that with the passage of this second resolution, that actually the Secretary of State is serious about engaging in some sort of negotiation. That they want to get this resolution and then step back and really try hard to negotiate. I hope that that's true. The positions are not that different right now. The U.S. says, stop enriching and then we'll talk. And the Iranians say, let's talk and then we'll talk, and then we'll probably suspend enrichment for a while. So, what's the difference between those two positions? I think there's room there.
But how do we get there? How do we take the top 5 issues and turn them into action that will be effective on the ground in Washington, D.C.?
So where are we in terms of the politics of the test ban treaty? Can this treaty be saved? Can it be resurrected? Reverend Edgar might know more about resurrection than I will, but I'll give it a try. I started out the talk by giving some key numbers, and the first number was 14. Despite the difficulties the test ban treaty has faced since it was signed, despite the unrelenting hostility of the Bush administration to that treaty, it's been 14 years since the United States has conducted a nuclear explosive test. 14 long years since the first George Bush conducted for the United States the last nuclear test. We've also been aided by actions in Congress to push back on some of the worst Bush policies. Again, I'm repeating some things already have been said, but it was Congress that defeated the nuclear bunker buster, helped push back on the low-yield nuclear weapon, and we'll see how it feels about this latest iteration, the reliable replacement warhead. When the administration was talking about speeding up the timetable for preparations to begin nuclear testing, Congress pushed back on that as well. Second key number is 2009. 2009. That's the year that a new American president will take office, specifically January 20th, 2009. That's the year I think we can begin resurrecting hope that we can get back to a test ban treaty, get a campaign going on its behalf, get a president interested, and try to bring it before the Senate again. I'd be less optimistic about the Republicans, but to turn that around, if a Republican president taking office in 2009 says, yes, we should go back to a test ban treaty, it's more likely to pass. By emphasizing 2009 as a key date, I'm also saying, of course, the next 20 months, forget it. If you're hoping to get a test ban treaty, even consider it seriously. But we do have a campaign for president that is well underway. If you haven't noticed, you've been in a cave for the last few months. And there's an opportunity to raise the test ban issue with the current candidates for president. There are opportunities to try to secure commitments, not just to consider and bring up and approve the test ban treaty, but to make that an important priority of the next administration. And moreover, we should be using these next 20 months to prepare a campaign for a test ban treaty, preparing a national campaign that could include media efforts, getting Republicans involved. Well, I'll talk more about that in the next section. There's a lot we can do over the next 20 months, but don't expect a test ban treaty to move before that time. The next key number I mentioned was 20. To even think of getting a president to take up the test ban treaty, or the United States to consider a vote on the treaty, we're going to need at least 20 Republican votes to win a 2/3 majority. And that means, as I was starting to say, we're going to have to think about a campaign that includes some retired Republican senators we might bring in to help work the Senate on this. Talk about validators, former national security officials. Colin Powell, of course, supported the treaty back during the Clinton years and continued to support it even when he took a position with the new administration. And I think a good break and a good step in that direction was that op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, signed by, among others, some very high-ranking former Republican officials like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. And I think that op-ed provides a way of thinking about where we can move. Obviously, the op-ed went a lot further than the test ban treaty and talked about eventually a world without nuclear weapons. I know Tom Graham talked about that earlier. But on the test ban treaty, the signers of that piece specifically talked about initiating a bipartisan process with the Senate, including understandings to increase confidence and provide for periodic review to achieve ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, taking advantage of recent technical advances, and working to secure ratification by other key states. We'll also need to get the weapons labs directors supporting the treaty, backing the treaty, conspiring to pass it rather than undermining it as they did in 1999. And we'll need to put the test ban treaty in the broader context of a nuclear non-proliferation policy, which almost certainly will be a key element of the national security strategy of the next president. Final number was 1. 1. That's the number of countries that are needed to jumpstart the test ban treaty process around the world. And that country is the United States. Until the United States moves towards reconsideration of the Test Ban Treaty, it's unlikely that there'll be much movement internationally. And whatever you think of the U.S. role in the world, it's going to take U.S. leadership not only to mobilize the United States, but to mobilize the international community to get the Chinese, the Pakistanis, and the Indians and the other countries approving this agreement. But I think there's great potential for 2009 and beyond. And what we need to be doing now is preparing for that time when a new president takes office and new possibilities arise.
But how can we communicate these breakthrough ideas?
A lot of people don't realize that we have the kind of arsenal we have. They don't realize that there's this plan to build more, which implies keeping these things into the indefinite future. So I think that might be kind of a headline, a way to get all the issues that have been mentioned here on the agenda.
I would like to see every political candidate asked 3 questions. What are your plans to protect the global commons? So what is the global commons? Well, the oceans, the ozone, the rainforests. We all depend on them, and no nation can protect them alone. You need a universal regime. What is your plan in dealing with global poverty? No longer necessary, it's morally indefensible, it creates instability, terrorism, etc. And what is your plan to get rid of nuclear weapons? And that we should be posing these threshold questions of every political candidate.
Now, actually, people are concerned about it. They're worried about Iran. They're worried about North Korea. They don't talk about our stuff so much, but there's an unease about nuclear weapons. We had the first war in the name of non-proliferation. That was Iraq, right? We've had plenty of talk about nuclear weapons. I think what's missing, though, is, and I, as a scholar on a university campus, I see a lot of young people who are interested in it, but there's a disconnect. They don't know quite how to take their interest. They want to do something. They don't know quite what to do or how to plug in. And in fact, the irony is that I have lots of interns, and they all, at one point I had 12 interns one semester, and they were all thinking about working at the CIA during the summer. I'm not saying the CIA is good or bad, but that's what when they're trying to take, I'm interested in world affairs, I'm concerned about these issues, I'm working for Jim Walsh on these issues, how do I translate that into a career? The only thing they can think of is the CIA. And I think there's a messaging problem. Dr. Caldecott talked about nuclear, about psychic numbing. I think there's a tendency for us to say, gloom and doom, the whole world's falling apart, we're all going to die, as a way to motivate people. You know, I don't know if that works so well.
As a former city politician in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I want to say that power, political power, is available in cities where it is not, because of money, media, and so forth, at the national level.
I think it's important that we tell people what the stakes are, but that we also call attention to the tremendous amount of success we've had, so that when we say we can be successful in the future, that makes sense. The climate change people have things that individuals can do to connect them to the issue. They have the offsets, right? They spend so much on the energy bill, and they do something personal that they feel is that they're doing about the issue. We need to come up with the nuclear equivalent of climate change offsets and think in those terms.
Remarkably, the experts agree that hope is succeeding over fear, and that the end of nuclear weapons is possible.
I've been in Congress the last 3 days, yesterday with Craig. I tell you what, with the Democrats in charge now, all doors are open. They are hungry to hear from us. They want agendas, they want programs, they want to know what to do.
Just quickly, one question that people have asked me is, okay, well, how are we making much of a difference in a room with our friends who already know the message? And the answer, or one answer is, I checked this morning and we are already on the national newswire. We also have people filming from a project that's working with the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and there will be a documentary which will include Craig and Helen and Tom Graham and many others.
We can talk about diplomacy, cooperation with other countries instead of confrontation, economic tools, intelligence sharing. There's a whole range of things we can do other than military force. And in fact, in the world we live in, military force is increasingly less relevant to some of these global problems we face. It's not going to help with HIV/AIDS. It's not going to help with the avian flu virus. It's not going to help with climate change. It's not really the best approach to dealing with terrorism, in my opinion. And that goes doubly so for nuclear weapons. They really have no legitimate mission, in my opinion.
Christians, Jews, Muslims, and other faith traditions to re-energize themselves around the question of eliminating nuclear weapons.
But if you look at some of the things that have happened since the end of the Cold War, nuclear arsenals globally have been cut more than 1/2. There are no tests by the major nuclear powers in close to 15 years. The Comprehensive Threat Reduction Program, mostly working with Russia, has eliminated thousands of nuclear weapons, untold tons of nuclear bomb-making material, and that same methodology with more resources could be applied globally, could accelerate the elimination of loose nukes and the securing of these bomb-making materials, which is one of the most important things we can do to head off nuclear terrorism. The blocking of the bunker buster by Congress, the defunding of it, which a lot of the groups that are here today really helped bring about. Congress's unwillingness to fund a new plutonium plant to make triggers for nuclear weapons.
They are well educated, these new Democrats, having grown up during the years of the freeze of the 80s. They know. Heads of the Armed Services Committee. They are ready to go.
In the next 5 years, we have a real chance at stopping this.
So I think it's a time of absolutely great opportunity. We've got to mobilise our forces, our energy, our passion.
The power and the energy to recognize that we need a surge of health care, not a surge of nuclear weapons. We need a surge of morality about issues of justice, not funds being spent on developing a new family of nuclear weapons. Walls along our border are not going to protect us. Nuclear weapons are not going to protect us. I think ending the proliferation of nuclear weapons is the moral agenda of our time.
But I think there's an opportunity now, and it's really incredibly exciting.
Without these measures, we can easily predict what the consequences could be.
That neutrons emitted during the fission of certain heavy metals would produce a chain reaction and release huge amounts of energy, making possible the atomic bomb. 12 years later, in the desert of New Mexico, the first nuclear weapon was tested and used subsequently against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb has been with us now for more than 40 years and has never been used again. But history does tell us that the absence of nuclear Armageddon during the Cold War may have simply been some good luck. A terrorist group with an improvised bomb could deliver it by truck and detonate it on the mall behind the White House. Because light travels faster than sound, persons close to ground zero would be incinerated before they heard what killed them. Temperatures of thousands of degrees Fahrenheit would vaporize the truck, the bomb, structures, and exposed persons. Within a third of a mile, most structures would be destroyed. Those left standing would be reduced to empty shells. Depending on their position and clothing, thousands of persons would be instantly injured, dead, or dying. Call again that there are fewer than, by last count, 70 burn beds in the District of Columbia. This man is a Russian engineer. He's suffering from the acute radiation syndrome. In September of 1986, when he was in the control room at Chernobyl, when the reactor exploded, he was exposed to an estimated 500 rem of radiation. He has the burns, the hair loss, bone marrow damage of the acute radiation syndrome. With good medical care, he survived. With no treatment or limited treatment, we would expect almost half the persons exposed to 500 rem to die. In this attack on Washington with a nuclear weapon, area hospitals would receive thousands of patients like this engineer, and radiation exposure from fallout downwind would sicken thousands more. PSR, in a recent report, explored our preparedness for instances of nuclear terrorism and drew two very important conclusions. First, that modest and affordable, reasonable preparedness measures for nuclear terrorism could save lives. Secondly, we are poorly prepared for any nuclear emergency or attack. Issues of central coordination, communication, evacuation, sheltering, hospital surge capacity, public education, public communication have not been resolved or significantly dealt with in most of our urban centers. From a public health point of view, effective preparedness for nuclear terrorism is good policy. Finally, if nuclear weapons were used to strike nuclear facilities in Iran, the effects would be disastrous. PSR used Department of Defense software and modeled strikes on the nuclear facilities at Esfahan and Natanz using the B-61 free-fall, earth-penetrating weapon with yields of 340 kilotons. The models calculated that in this type of attack, conceivably up to 2 million people would die would die relatively promptly, some killed by direct radiation, others by burn and trauma. And within days, some 10 million folks would be exposed to significant doses of radiation from fallout indicated by the colored plumes on the map. These effects would not be confined to Iran, but would spread to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India.